Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this balmy night. I now feel like excited when it's 30 degrees or higher. That's what it's come to here. I'm Linda Johnson. I'm the president and CEO of Brooklyn Public Library, and welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. CBH, as we call it, is home to the most expansive collection of Brooklyn history in the world. An astonishing array of books, manuscripts, letters, diaries, photographs, maps, oral histories, and more. And as of 2 years ago, all Brooklynites and curious minds have free and open access to these resources. Researchers, authors, and anyone who is curious can enter to read, to gather, and to learn about our borough. No appointment necessary. Anyone can learn about the history of their neighborhood, their block, and even their building. We have guides and genealogical research in Brooklyn and Long Island, and one-on-one research support from staff. CBH also makes genealogy research easier and more affordable by providing genealogy workshops and free access to Ancestry.com at all of our 62 public library branches. But tonight is a very different night and really special. I'm extremely excited to be here. The author that we will be hearing from shortly dove into archives from South Carolina to trace his own family history. In Freedom Lost, Freedom Won, Eugene Robinson weaves the personal and the political, mapping generations of resilience. The book just came out today, and you can purchase a copy after tonight's talk, and he promises to remain and sign your books. And although I feel like I've known Gene Robinson for a long time because I've watched him for so long, we just met tonight. But I think, like me, once you hear his voice, you'll feel like you're hearing from an old friend. I suspect we have a few of his fans in the audience. Gene is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, former columnist, and associate editor of The Washington Post, author and political analyst on MSNBC. He has served as foreign editor and reported across the globe from London to Buenos Aires. Gene has written 3 books, including Coal to Cream, A Black Man's Journey Beyond Color to an Affirmation of Race, Last Dance in Havana, The Final Days of Fidel and the Start of the New Cuban Revolution, and Disintegration, The Splintering of Black America. Gene will be joined by Darren Walker, who I have known for a long time. Darren is the new president and CEO of the production and management company Anonymous Content. He is a powerhouse in the nonprofit world, having recently stepped down as president of the Ford Foundation. He was formerly vice president at Rockefeller Foundation and chief operating officer of the Abyssinian Development Corporation. Darren co-founded both the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and the President's Council on Disability Inclusion in Philanthropy. He currently serves on a seemingly endless number of boards and has been a great supporter of the library. Welcome, Gene and Darren.
Well, good evening, Brooklyn. We are happy to be in the house. We are always happy to be in Brooklyn. My brother Eugene Robinson has written a masterpiece.
Oh, Darren.
This book is a love letter to your forebears. It's a love letter to America. It is a manifestation in the most beautiful prose of Black excellence. And I want to get to a few observations about this book and then into some questions that I have just been obsessing about all week since I dove into your book. But what you're able to do here in an explanation of your family's history is to show us American history through the lens of your forebears. And you talk about this first by telling us about a boy named Harry, a boy called Harry.
Yeah.
Tell us about this boy called Harry and why he is so central to this book.
This boy called Harry in 1829 was in Charleston, South Carolina, was sold by a woman named Isabella Perman to a plantation owner, a Charleston area plantation owner named Richard Fordham. He was sold along with a woman named Jenny and her children, I think, Hagar and Margaret. And for the lot, Richard Fordham paid, I think it was $1,300. And that boy named Harry was my great-great-grandfather. He was put to work at a blacksmith's forge, and he became a very skilled blacksmith. And in 1848, he was sold again, this time to a Charleston businessman named Otis Mills, and for $2,000, which was
A lot of money.
that was a lot of money back then. I mean, the going rate for a field hand, I can't believe I'm talking like this, but it's true, was about $700 in Charleston. So it's an indication that he had these skills. And in 1851, he parlayed these skills into his own freedom in Charleston. So he became a free person of color.
In Charleston in
51, right. 10 years before the Civil War.
And how many free people in Charleston? Any idea? I mean,
It was something because they counted
Yes.
actually, and the way I found the year 1851 was I found it in the Free Negro book. The people of Charleston really wanted to keep track of free black people because they really didn't. They just were not comfortable with that. Right, the whole idea of being black and free didn't make a lot of sense to them. So they acknowledged it, but they didn't particularly like it. So if you were a free black person in Charleston, you had to pay $2.75 a year to be a free black person in Charleston. There was a capitation tax, and they kept a roll of who had paid the tax. At the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston, going through year after year after year, I found the year that he freed himself. I had always known from my childhood that he had been free before the Civil War because his son, my great-grandfather, I knew had been born free, and he built the house that I grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina.
And this is such a fascinating story. You tell the story. This house was in your family. How many generations? I mean, I've actually never heard.
Yeah, a bunch of generations. No, I mean, great-grandfather, and my and there was a generation earlier, actually, because my great-grandmother's mother lived there too. And
We're talking about well over a century. I mean,
oh yeah, no, it's well over a century, and it is still in the family. My sister and I own it now.
Yes.
And the first thing you saw when you walk into the house is a formal, photographic portrait of my great-grandfather, Major John Hammond Fordham. He was a major because he was a major in a post-Civil War black militia in Charleston. And that's what everybody called him. That's what my mother and grandmother and great-aunt called him, Major Fordham. And so that's how I knew him. And he was a pack rat. He saved everything.
Thank God for those pack rats in our families.
He saved his speeches. He saved his letters. As a matter of fact, he saved his important things in a safe that he kept in his bedroom. And it's like one of these big, like, cartoon safes, you know, like the Roadrunner would drop on Wile E. Coyote's head. Of course, after he died, they had to break into it because he wouldn't give anybody the combination. But so he kept important stuff in there. But under the beds, there were like these boxes filled with his bank statements and mortgage documents. And he was a lawyer, so there were records from his law practice, and there was all this stuff. So that's. You know, I always knew I had this rich load of material, and I knew from his documents and also from my grandmother and great aunt, you know, his daughters, that their grandfather had been free before the Civil War. It took me a while to pin down the year, but I finally got it.
But so much of your family's history is about American history because they were in Charleston, and so we have Fort Sumter.
Yeah.
I mean, and your family was there.
Yes, my family was there. The two big things that I really learned and internalized doing this book. Number one, that I came to see the story as really a quintessential archetypal American story. You know, I've always known that there is no American history without African American history. Without that very important strand of American history, this would be a very different country. But I realized that generation after generation, they were doing what all Americans are supposed to do.
They were doing more than what all. I mean,
well, they had to do more, right,
exactly.
Because,
They were extraordinary exemplars.
Yeah, they were
of
pretty
excellence.
amazing people. They were pretty amazing people. You know, Henry Fordham, who freed himself. By the time the 1860 census came around, he owned a couple of houses in Charleston. He was a partner in a blacksmith's forge and was doing pretty well. But he had to go through this cycle, right? So he frees himself in 1851. That decade leading up to Fort Sumter, 1861, in Charleston, was extremely fraught, especially for free black people in Charleston. And so he had all this freedom and this opportunity, and then it was constricted. And, you know, some free black people in Charleston who didn't have papers to prove their freedom were just snatched up and sold into slavery. Many others, perhaps hundreds of others, decided to leave. They left South Carolina going north to friendlier territory. But there was a law that they passed that if a free black person left South Carolina, fine, but they could never come back. They could never come back in the state. And there were bills seriously debated in the state legislature about just abolishing this whole free and black category and just take them all and, you know, enslave them all, basically. So that was the atmosphere he lived in up to and through the war.
And then on the other side of the war, you have family members who are involved in all sorts of important endeavors, including the Republican Party, which was at that time a welcoming place for Black
those were
people.
the good guys. Those were really the good guys.
So tell us about the Republican Party and its welcoming of Black people
Well,
and your forebear.
Well, the South Carolina Republican Party, as far as white South Carolinians were concerned, the Republicans were the devil, right? And Lincoln was the devil. And so there wasn't a Republican Party really until after the war, and it was founded by Robert Smalls, a black man who had performed one of the most daring exploits of the Civil War. He was a trained seaman, and he and some other African Americans were forced to work as crew on a Confederate ship that just it didn't go very far out to sea because the Union was blockading Charleston, but around the harbor area, they sailed and they carried munitions and so forth here and there. And so one night, the white officers who were in charge of the ship decided they would go ashore and enjoy a night in Charleston in the city, and they would just leave the black crew on the ship, which they had done before, and so that was fine. And Robert Smalls told them, I'd like to invite our families to see us while you're away. And they had done that before, so okay. So the officers go ashore, the families come onto the ship, and Robert Smalls said, "We gonna be free," and so he set sail immediately and going out of the harbor. And the skipper, the white skipper of the ship, wore a kind of very distinctive straw hat, and so Smalls had a hat just like that. And he put on the hat, and as he was sailing out past the Confederate sentries, past Fort Sumter and Fort Wagner and Fort Moultrie, he looked in silhouette in the darkness like the skipper, and he knew what signals to give, and so he just gave the right signals, and he just sailed on out. And he got to the line of Union ships that was blockading the harbor, and then they put up a white sheet so that the Union wouldn't fire on them, and it was a huge deal in the Civil War. It's a big, propaganda coup for the Union, and it actually played a role in convincing Abraham Lincoln to use more black soldiers in the Union Army.
So just another footnote in your family's history. This is like amazing. So anyhow,
so he founded the South Carolina Republican Party, and if you were an ambitious young black man, educated, my great-grandfather went to the first accredited secondary school for African Americans, founded in Charleston after the war. He became a lawyer. He was a young man out to make something of himself, and one of the roots to that was through the Republican Party, because remember the Union troops were still occupying the South then, and so that was where the power was, and he became a big sort of poobah in the South Carolina Republican Party. He went to all the national political conventions, all the Republican inaugurations. He corresponded with Theodore Roosevelt. He was an interesting and formidable man.
And then came the Black Code.
Oh yeah, right.
So
right.
I actually, again, so many revelations in this book. I've never heard of the Black Code.
Right. So this was, after the war. Fortunately, this was while the Union troops were still occupying Charleston. The South Carolina legislature was still at that point in Democratic hands, and they passed a black code that essentially would have re-enslaved African Americans, and it said that that basically. If you were black and you weren't working for a white person, you could be forced to work for a white person, and you had to refer to the white person as master, and you were a servant, and this is all written down, and they passed this, and they were going to put it into effect, but the Union commander of the forces of the Union forces in Charleston was so outraged at this. He had lost a leg at Gettysburg, and he was just in no mood for this. And so he, before they could actually start implementing it, he snatched it away, tore it up, and said, "No, we're not doing this." And as a matter of fact, we're having universal suffrage starting now. And so thus the Republicans were able to take control.
But ultimately, they instituted a de facto political and cultural climate that made, if not policy and practice, black people still deeply, profoundly,
absolutely,
constrained and contained in terms of what they could do and who they could work for.
Well, it's a funny thing. As long as the Union troops were
Right.
there,
But
it was fine. And then in, the 1876 election was, a disputed election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, the incumbent, and Hayes was a Republican. It's back and forth. They both claimed to have won. They had competing slates of electors. It was just kind of like, like Trump Biden, but anyhow, the way they worked it out was a compromise, and the compromise was that Hayes would get enough electoral votes from the Democrats so that he could remain president. He was the winner of the election, and what the Democrats got was a pledge to withdraw the Union troops. And so in 1877, the Union troops got pulled out of the South. And that was really the beginning. It took a while to gain steam, but that was the beginning of Jim Crow. That was the beginning of the Jim Crow era. And what I saw as I sort of found the story in my great-grandfather's papers was that you could see that. You could see the period when he was really on the rise. He moved the family inland to Orangeburg, which was where the first historically black college in South Carolina, Claflin University, had been founded. He was buying land. He was, lending money to friends and associates. He was buying stuff, and then you see it kind of level off, and then gradually he becomes more of a borrower than a lender, and he becomes more of a seller than a buyer. And, he had been,
a very prosperous man, relative. This is a time
relatively speaking, he was,
when 95% of the white population had a third-grade education. So for this black man to have achieved prosperity at this scale was remarkable and also enviable. And so I'm sure there came a time when he was too prosperous.
Well, he somehow managed to, he survived. He had less money, less prosperity, and certainly a lot less than he would have had. But he had his house. He still had some land that he had bought when it was cheap, and he was able to sell it for a bit more. But this was as the curtain was descending. I mean, it was 1892 when a big Confederate memorial statue of a rebel soldier went up in the middle of Orangeburg, and that wasn't about the Civil War. That was, yeah, we lost the war, we're going to win the peace. That was about winning, who's winning now. Because, without the Union troops there, the Democrats had effectively disenfranchised African Americans and were back in charge.
Well, and they were commencing a propaganda campaign.
It was exactly the Lost Cause propaganda campaign that continues to this day. It was certainly going on when I was in high school. So, and it wasn't just propaganda. It was also when you saw the steep rise in lynchings.
You write about that in
across the South, yes, just horrific incidents, horrific things.
Well, I want to just intervene here on behalf of the family historian, because you express ambivalence early in the book about your family's history, and did you need to know, and was it that important? And then you have this aunt.
Yes.
Who is, and we all have an aunt, a great aunt, a grandmother
Grace.
who's like a resilient Black woman who is like, will not take no for an answer.
Yeah, that's pretty much all the women in my family. So my mother was an only child, but her mother, my grandmother, had 5 siblings, and they all had children. So my mother had all these first cousins, and they had scattered around the country. And one of them was Aunt Grace, and she actually I wrote a piece about the house that Major Fordham had built in like the 80s. Shortly after I got to the Post, I wrote this essay for the Outlook section, and the biggest response came from Aunt Grace, that made her really interested in the family's genealogy and just to kind of try to write it down, because we had this rich sort of family lore, and we had a good deal of documentation, but she pinned down a lot of things and worked really hard at it, and as I was researching, she missed by a year here, she missed by a little bit there, but it was incredible work. She was great.
Well, and you do really pay homage to the women of your family. This isn't just about the men, and when we come to the 20th century, there's some remarkable women.
Oh, yeah. So Major Fordham had 3 sons and 3 daughters. And one of the daughters was my grandmother, who was a piano teacher. She was a teacher, basically.
Which for Black people and Black women was the highest occupation in our community.
Yeah, right. You could be a teacher or you could be a nurse. And so my grandmother, growing up in the house, my grandmother and my great aunt, Florella, whom we called Aunt Doc, were there. And my grandmother had been a teacher and my great aunt was a nurse. And she was actually the first accredited nurse, Black or white, in Orangeburg, in the town, and she was a formidable woman. She was really something. She had gone to Claflin University, and then she wanted to go to nursing school. There wasn't conveniently, there wasn't really any place nearby she could go to nursing school, so she went off to Hampton Institute in Virginia, and became a nurse. And I remember her when I was a little kid. She always had her white uniform on. She was essentially the chief medical officer for South Carolina State University, another HBCU in Orangeburg, for 30 years or something, and then and she retired for like a couple of months, and then she became the chief medical officer for Claflin University, which is right next door, and she worked until she must have been way in her 80s, I think.
And as you proceed in the story of your family in the 20th century, you get to Detroit, which, of course,
right.
I was very interested in the history of your family and Henry Ford and the Rouge plant, and you have a few things to say about Henry Ford. I can't imagine why. But I'll let you explain.
Yeah, he was a piece of work. So that's all of what I've said before was my mother's side of the family. I also researched my father's side of the family, which was much more challenging. First of all, I wasn't surrounded by his history the way I was by the mother's side of the family. And second, he was of that very taciturn, stoic World War II generation, right? And so it was like pulling teeth to get anything out of him. The person who was most successful in getting information out of him was Avis, actually, my late wife.
Amazing wife.
Darren knows that she was pretty good at it, but I actually learned a lot about my father's life in the course of doing this book. He was born in rural Georgia, and his family. He's unusual because he did the Great Migration in both directions. His family headed north, and ended up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, outside of Detroit. They didn't want to live in Detroit, they wanted to live in Ann Arbor. And I think that was my grandmother Robinson, who wanted to live in the town where the university was. She hadn't gone to college, but her kids were going to go to college. And my father and both his brothers at various times all worked for Henry Ford at the big River Rouge plant in Detroit, which at the time was the biggest integrated factory in the world. And it's just vast. There were train cars that would bring in rocks, and train cars that would take out finished Model Ts. So they had a steel mill, they had their own electricity plant, they had their own everything. I mean, it was quite amazing. My father did not like working there, and to the point where he would never, in his entire life, buy a Ford. And in fact, he wouldn't even talk about buying a Ford. I remember when the Mustang first came out, and I was like, "Daddy, let's get a Mustang." And he was like, "Rah, rah, rah, rah," he yelled at me, and I'm like, "Oh, I just want, it's a cool car." No, it's not. So.
Well, because when he worked at the River Rouge plant, the black employees, the black men, did the most dangerous work. That was, I mean, there was no OSHA then, but
there was no OSHA.
Goodness,
one of the popular jobs was, processing some chemical. Cyanide was involved. Right? So. Send the black guys to go work in the cyanide plant, and good luck to them. But black workers did go work for Henry Ford. He didn't want to hire them at first, but as he started to scale up, he said, I need these workers. And so he'd pay $5 a day, and
And a black middle class in
black
Detroit
middle
was
class.
created.
Yeah.
Segregated, the housing and
Segregated, but it was a black
education.
middle class. The boxer Joe Louis went to work at the Ruse plant briefly, and he had tried boxing, and he said, he wasn't winning. He said, this is too hard. I'll go get a job at the Ford plant. He lasted about 2 months, and after that, he wrote in his autobiography, he said, well, if I got to work this hard and be this beat up at the end of the day, I might as well go back to fighting. So it was tough.
And you weave in these stories of really remarkable and interesting, intriguing characters. And one that I particularly like, it'll be obvious when you tell the audience why, was your godfather, Charles Edward Murray.
Yes.
Who sounds fascinating. Your confirmed bachelor godfather.
Yes, he was a confirmed bachelor. And he was this extraordinary man, actually, from an even smaller town, a very small town in Williamsburg County, a town called Greeleyville, and he had been essentially abandoned as an infant. He had been taken in and adopted by a family there who kind of knew my grandmother, and so when he was college age, and he was young too. I think he was 16 or something, and they sent him to Orangeburg to go to South Carolina State, and he boarded at our house. And my mother was a young girl when he arrived, and so he was like the older brother my mother never had, and I remember when I was a kid, we'd go visit him in Greeleyville, where he had become this extraordinary educator. He was principal of the local school, and it was just an incredible place. Not a single piece of litter or trash anywhere, not a blade of grass too long. Everything totally spick and span. Every child addressed every adult as Mr. or Mrs. He was a disciplinarian, but he was just extraordinary. And the school is now named after him. It's the Charles E. School in Greeleyville. And we'd go to Greeleyville on a Sunday and visit him, and the town took care of him, right? But he was a very sort of, in his manner and in his bearing, he was really a flamboyantly gay man.
He was a gay man. He was very gay. He sounds gay to me. I mean, my goodness.
And
what you say here, I'm like, wow, this is amazing.
And I remember one time one of the ladies, mothers of kids or something, it brought him some food for Sunday dinner, and so she stopped by, and after she left, and I remember my parents just kind of joking, "Oh, Edward, I think Miss So-and-so, I think she's sweet on you. I think you're finally going to have to get married." And I remember thinking, I was probably like 8, right? So I didn't know what gay was, but I remember thinking, Edward is not going to marry that lady, Like, that is not happening. I don't know why, but it's not happening. And no one ever mentioned this. No one ever said a thing. But he was not. It's not just that he was accepted. He was lionized for his accomplishment. But he did. I found out that he, like everybody, he was drafted and served in World War II. And he had an interesting assignment. He was sent, along with a black unit, because, obviously the army was segregated, he was sent to Iran of all places, a coastal city in Iran, where the Allies would bring military supplies, and they would be shipped across Iran into the Soviet Union for use by Stalin, basically, on the Eastern Front. And that was, you couldn't get these weapons all the time across the Atlantic because of the German U-boats, so they would sort of take that long way around. He wrote letters home. I love the fact that people used to write letters. I don't know what we're going to do in the future, but he wrote letters home from his deployment, and he referred to the adjustment that both he and especially my grandfather had to make when he first came to live at the house, and that they had, it had taken them a while to get used to each other, but they eventually became like a father and son, and he was sending, I think he sent cigars home for my grandfather.
Gene, I want to get to today because there's so much here, and we could go decade by decade. But you, of course, because you are a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, which, of course, I was looking for, and your humility is problematic. Why? There is no place in here where you talk about all of your awards and all the things that, my goodness, I mean, you should have had a chapter that says, and now my extraordinary life.
This was about the ancestors, and in this book, I wanted to show that it's not just the now. I mean, it just how African Americans and every story is distinctive, but my story has a lot in common with that of many African Americans. I wanted to show that we were there in all these great historical events throughout, from the beginning, from before the Mayflower, and there were some events and some periods that we perhaps saw from a different vantage point. I think most white Americans, when they think of 1919, that year, don't think of the Red Summer, but
They don't know what the Red Summer is.
exactly. But the Red Summer was.
We know what
Yeah, exactly. And every black person alive at that time knew what the Red Summer was. It was a series of deadly white-on-black race riots in cities across the country. Extremely violent, huge riot in Chicago, huge riot in Washington, and it was the troops were all coming back from World War I. The Great Migration was reaching a peak, and so there was this competition for jobs, for housing, for resources. That was the sort of landscape in which this all sparked off. The worst incident was actually in rural Arkansas, where the farmers basically tried to unionize, to demand better prices for their crops, black farmers, and white authorities and vigilantes killed, nobody knows how many, but a couple of hundred people at least.
Because they were protesting that
Yeah,
potatoes from black farmers, the same potatoes that white farmers
Oh yeah, yeah. No, they wouldn't.
they got less money
they
for
wouldn't pay
those
black-
same potatoes.
No, they
because
wouldn't
they
pay-
were black.
what are you talking about? No, they're not going to pay the black farmers the same as the white farmers. I mean, it just, and so things like that. I mean, one of my great uncles, another of Major Fordham's children, served in World War I and was sent to the Western Front, and nobody ever talked about that except to say that he was never quite the same afterwards. And so I managed to find his army records, and I learned that he had already studied to become a pharmacist, and so he was sent to train with the 92nd Infantry, the Black Infantry in Fort Riley, Kansas, in a corner of that military reservation that was kind of the Negro corner because segregation, and then shipped out, went to France, and was assigned to a mule-drawn ambulance. There were mule-drawn ambulances and there were motorized ambulances, and the mule-drawn ambulances could get closer to the actual front because they could go over the rutted terrain and through the mud in a way that the trucks couldn't. And so he was right there on the front lines, treating and triaging and taking casualties back to the field hospital. And I managed to find an oral history that had been given by a black man who had served in the same unit that my great uncle had served in, so I could get a sense of what the sights and sounds and smells were like and what his life was like then. And he was, and everybody agreed he was never the same after we'd call it PTSD. They called it shell shock, but and so again, in all these great historical evils, we were there.
Absolutely. And I don't know if it was what Jefferson said to Hamilton, but this idea that, yes, we are one, but we are not all the same. And I think you tell the story of, that is the story of an American patriot. And from the perspective of American history, that is your family's history, and that is not the same as everyone else's history. And I think just understanding that.
It's not the same as everyone else's history, but at the same time, it's part of, it's a strand of American history that is necessary, without which American history is very different. And I just, I was, as I discovered that, yes, I can tell this story with my family. That's what sort of kept me going. That I could, I thought I could actually pull it off.
You did pull it off. I mean, you tell the story so beautifully, so movingly.
Well, I want to mention one more incident or one more moment, which was when Major Fordham, my great grandfather who built the house, who was prosperous and a success, but Jim Crow was coming down, and lynchings were happening, and outside of Orangeburg, and it was things were bad, and so, but he was still prominent enough that he could command an audience, and so he spoke at the Opera House in Columbia, the state capital, and he gave a speech, and it's the only speech that he kept his handwritten draft of in his safe, and basically in the speech he said, "Look, we started from nothing. After the Civil War, we had nothing. Today, black farmers owned X thousand acres of land and are producing, all, this quantity of crops, and he listed the crops, and he said, and what's more, we have this many black doctors and lawyers and teachers and insurance companies and we're going to have more. So would you just please leave us alone? It was just a plea. I'm not asking for anything. Just to leave us alone, and we'll be fine. And of course, the plea fell on deaf ears, but I kind of quote that speech at length in the book because it's just such a poignant moment and just a plaintive voice. Is that so hard? Could you just leaving us alone? But it was too hard.
It was far too much to ask.
Yeah, really.
So we're going to have questions from this wonderful audience for Eugene Robinson. And I believe we have mics. Yes. We have 2 runners with mics. So if you have a question, just raise your hand.
Okay.
And
no.
we have here on the front row, wherever you want to start. Let me tell you that we ask that you please stand. And this is a question and answer. So a question ends with a question mark. And we just ask that you be as succinct as possible because we have so many smart and intelligent and interesting Brooklynites here. We want to hear from as many as we can. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. Do you have any longitudinal plans to preserve the Major Hammond House in Orangeburg, like donating it to South Carolina Parks and Rec for a museum? Like, what are the long-term plans so that this physical?
Great question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and my sister and I are working on that. The house was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1985, so it's on that, and there is a bit of a historic district that has been designated in Orangeburg now. The highlight of the historic district will be the first civil rights museum in South Carolina that's being put together. And I was down there recently, and the building's almost done. It's very exciting. And so the house is about 3 blocks from there. It's right across from Claflin University, where my mother was the librarian for 30 years, the head librarian. And I've had conversations with Claflin about perhaps the house can be, a study center or something like that. So I think that's the likely the likely outcome for the house. For now, my sister, more she than I, because she lives in Orangeburg but not in the house, but she's been keeping it up, and that's kind of the next project after the book.
Thank you. We're going to go to the back here, please. Yes.
Was your great-great-grandfather an architect or an engineer when he constructed his house, the original house, in 1851? Wow. Or was he just a genius?
Yes.
No. So my great-great-grandfather, who became free in 1851, he was a blacksmith. He was obviously very good with his hands, but as far as I know, the 2 houses that he owned in Charleston, he probably purchased somehow, I guess. My great-grandfather, when I say he built the house that I grew up in, I mean built it in the sense of he hired a builder to build it, because I have he left in a safe the contract for the house, and it cost something like $1,700. This is a 2-story southern house with a big wide porch and this and that. But He did. He must have been fairly good with his hands because at one point he owned a steam engine and had it somewhere on the property. I've never figured out exactly what that was about.
Did you have a brief follow-up, and we can? Did you have a brief follow-up? I'm just.
No, I was going to ask, are you familiar with the Avery Research Center?
That is where my great-grandfather went to school. The Avery, it was then the Avery Normal Institute on Bull Street in Charleston, first accredited school for African Americans in Charleston after the war. Opened in 1868, and he was there. The building is still there, and it is now the Avery Research Institute. It's now under the aegis of the College of Charleston, and it's become a research center where they have all the archives of the early years of the Avery Institute. But it's good question.
Great. Yes, please.
What was the biggest surprise that you found doing your research?
Great questions. Yes.
Oh,
Biggest
that's
surprise.
The biggest surprise. Well, I guess the biggest macro surprise was that there was this sort of that the narrative of Black American history as part of American history was so very rich that I could have written, I could have written 3 times as much as I did, right? And my publisher wouldn't let me, but I could have. The biggest sort of micro surprise was that my great aunt, whom we lived with, the nurse, she never married. And I told you my mother had all these first cousins and so our house was a home place, so they would come and, from all over, from Cincinnati, from Washington, from Buffalo, Tallahassee, they'd come in and visit. And my mother and grandmother would always explain, "Oh, that's your Uncle Marion's daughter, and this is your Uncle Harry's son," but there was one cousin who would come from New York, one of my mother's cousins, and she was cousin Rosalie. And when I asked, so who is cousin Rosalie? And my mother said, "We don't know." And so I knew at a very early age that couldn't be true, but I could never get a straight answer out of it. And so it turns out that cousin Rosalie was the daughter of my great aunt, who didn't marry, but who did have a daughter. And unfortunately, by the time I figured this out, there was nobody still alive I could kind of ask about that. But from what I could gather, this would not have pleased her father at all, right? and so I wondered how they handled that. She was obviously welcomed in the family, and in fact, must have been taken care of by my great grandmother, when my great aunt was off at Hampton. But it actually was one of those things that really clicked, because cousin Rosalie she's the spitting image of my great aunt. I mean, she looks just like her, and a little bit taller, but same smile, the same eyes, the same everything. So that was kind of a surprise.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was going to say, coincidentally, my father, who is from Charleston, attended Avery Institute.
Uh-huh.
And also, coincidentally, my mother graduated from Hampton Institute Nursing School in 1938. So I was wondering if that date kind of coincides with your great aunt?
My great aunt was older than that. So, she was born in 1880 maybe or something like that. So she would have been through nursing school by that time for sure.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. It truly is an American story. You said you had so much research, you had so many documents and letters and just a lot of proceedings. How did you gather all of that material to create stories? Because listening to this, it sounded like this is really a lot of stories. You're not just reading facts. We have a number of stories. So what was the process that you used, and how long did it take?
Well, doing the book took 4.5 years, almost 5 years, really. I was also doing a few other things, right? I was writing a column, I was doing TV, I was, so I wasn't working on, day in and day out. When I left the Washington Post last year, I spent 2 weeks just sort of wandering around, not knowing what to do. I was like, I don't have a deadline. What am I supposed? What do I do? And then, of course, I realized, no, I was close on the book. I had, was maybe 80% of the way there, and I knew how I was going to wrap it up. And so I called my editor and I said, okay, this is going to be what we do. How to make stories out of the documents really is reporting. The documents will tell a story if you look hard enough, and if you dig deep and you report deeply as you can about the context and what was going on, around the people that you're specifically writing about, and so there was a lot of that, sometimes it's very frustrating because I want to know what this was like, and then voila, you find the oral history taken by the guy who was in the unit with the exact same unit with my great uncle, and so I could tell a richer story about his World War I service than otherwise I might have. So it's checking, cross-referencing, checking again.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, please.
I just want to say thank you. I thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank
I'm
you.
so filled with emotion.
Oh,
I came to Brooklyn when I was 18 years old as a young married mother from Louisiana. I'm 85 last week. And all the stories that you're telling, I've lived through it with 3 brothers in World War II, one in Korea, and one on the fringes of Vietnam. The stories of a father who came into Louisiana that we never knew his family. But because I was always curious and wanted to hear stories from older people, I have no written documentation, but in my heart and my mind, I could relate to everything you're saying.
Oh.
How can a person like me tell my story to future generations? I'm a retired school teacher, guidance counselor. I came here with a high school diploma, but God has been so good to me. And I always think that we have to pass along to future generations. I really thank you, Eugene. I watch you in the mornings on Morning Joe.
Thank you.
And I saw you doing.
Thank you.
I've seen you on the circuit of your speeches from this book. And I always say I'm going to read, but I'm truly going to read this book.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I thank you.
So
I
touches
just
my
want to
heart.
tell you, thank you so much
Well, thank you.
for this book. And I'm going to spread the word.
Thank
you.
Thank you
Well,
very much.
Thank
thank
you for that
Thank you
beautiful
very
testimony.
much. And how can you tell your story? You have just told it beautifully, and if it's comfortable to you, I think you ought to just. You you don't actually seem that shy to me. And that is a good thing. That is a good thing. But you know, record yourself and tell those stories. Tell the stories you remember.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have other for
We
one more
have time
question?
for one more question right up here.
Yes, please, madam.
And then afterwards, Jean
Yeah.
will sign books in the front.
I also want to say thank you, but I also want to say you had said something in passing about the things that you had learned that were important today. I was wondering what it was that you'd learned from your history that presaged what's happening now.
Oh, y'all got a minute? You know, of course, there's a sort of meta story about resilience that I learned, but I saw this repeated cycle. It's why the title, Freedom Lost, Freedom Won. I saw these repeated times when African Americans, and this does apply to other marginalized groups as well, but when, you know, people fought and died to claim a bit more of the freedom and opportunity that this nation promises, and then it was taken away again. And that happened over and over again. And I will never to my dying day think it's a coincidence that right after the first black president serves his 2 terms in the White House, here comes Donald Trump, and he's elected president. And the whole MAGA movement, which is about taking America back to the way it was, which doesn't mean the same thing to us as it does to, as I guess it does to them. So that, I think that's a lesson for today. And it's, you know, there are times when it's going to be a struggle, and we're going to have to struggle. And at those times, we might not necessarily know exactly how it's going to come out, but in the past, we have managed to get past them and to the next, you know, to the next phase. Unfortunately, it happens again, but we've managed, and over time, I mean, you know, we are sitting here. This is the former, you know, head of the Ford Foundation who's about to go to Hollywood, and you know, and I've had a pretty good journalism career, and these, you know, we would have been impossible 50 years ago. We would have been unthinkable 100 years ago. We probably would have been shot 150 years ago. So.
Well, I want to say, Gene, thank you. And you deserve all of the accolades. You're receiving all the adoration and admiration from this audience for this gift to us all. Freedom lost, freedom won. Today is the publication date, and this is his first outing on publication day. Mm-hmm. We thank you for making Brooklyn.
Yeah, no.
We thank the
Brooklyn.
Center for Brooklyn History.
Brooklyn
And
House.
Gene has promised to sign each and every book. And so we will go to the back, and Gene looks forward to spending time.
Yes, I do.
all.
And let me just quickly thank you, Darren, for you know, really appreciate you being here. Very grateful, my friend, and thank all of you for coming out on this balmy evening. Very balmy.